In the year 1700, inside the magnificent palace of Spain, a king sat upon his throne. Yet he could not chew his food, could not finish a single sentence, and his mind was trapped at the level of a child. This was Charles II, the last ruler of the Habsburg dynasty, a man imprisoned in a body destroyed by his own bloodline. This was not a random illness, but the result of 200 years of inbreeding, a horrific genetic experiment that dragged one of Europe's greatest empires to its downfall. Before diving into these forgotten stories of dynasties destroyed by their own obsession with purity, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The Habsburg dynasty didn't start as monsters. They began in the 11th century as minor Swiss nobles, clever politicians who understood that strategic marriages could build empires more effectively than armies ever could. Their family motto, Subsidy, "Let others wage war, you happy Austria marry," became the blueprint for European domination through bedroom politics rather than battlefield conquest. But somewhere along the way, this brilliant strategy transformed into something far darker. The Habsburgs discovered that marrying within their own family allowed them to consolidate power, prevent territories from being divided among different dynasties, and maintain what they believed was the divine purity of their bloodline. What they didn't understand was that they were conducting a genetic experiment that would ultimately destroy everything they sought to protect. Emperor Maximilian I, ruling from 1493 to 1519, established the template for Habsburg matrimonial politics. His own marriage to Mary of Burgundy brought vast territories under Austrian control, while his son Philip married Joanna of Castile, uniting the Habsburg domains with the emerging Spanish Empire. These early marriages created the most powerful dynasty in European history, controlling territories from Austria to the Americas. But Maximilian also made a fateful decision that would haunt his descendants for centuries. He began the practice of arranging marriages between Habsburg cousins, believing that keeping wealth and power within the family would strengthen their dynasty. He couldn't have been more wrong. The science of genetics wouldn't be understood for another 400 years. But the consequences of inbreeding were already becoming apparent by the early 16th century. When closely related individuals reproduce, they're likely to carry the same recessive genes. In normal circumstances, harmful recessive traits remain hidden because they're paired with dominant healthy genes from an unrelated partner. But when both parents carry the same recessive genes, their children have a 25% chance of inheriting double doses of genetic problems. The Habsburgs were essentially playing Russian roulette with their DNA, and with each generation they were loading more bullets into the chamber. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor from 1519 to 1556, exemplified both the heights of Habsburg power and the beginning of their genetic decline. Ruling an empire that stretched from Vienna to Mexico City, Charles controlled more territory than any European monarch before or since. Yet even at the peak of Habsburg dominance, the effects of inbreeding were becoming visible. Contemporary portraits reveal the distinctive Habsburg jaw beginning to emerge, the protruding lower lip that would become the dynasty's most recognizable and ultimately fatal characteristic. Charles himself suffered from gout, epilepsy, and premature aging that left him looking ancient by 40. More troubling for the dynasty's future, his son Philip II inherited not just the Spanish territories but also the genetic burden that came with them. Philip II of Spain, ruling from 1556 to 1598, presided over the golden age of Spanish power while his own body bore witness to the growing cost of Habsburg marriage practices. Philip married 4 times, but 3 of his wives were close relatives. His first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal, was his double first cousin, meaning they shared the same 4 grandparents. Their son, Don Carlos, represented the first catastrophic failure of Habsburg genetics. Born with severe physical deformities and profound mental disabilities, Don Carlos exhibited violent behavior that made him completely unsuitable for rule. He tortured animals, attacked servants without provocation, and showed signs of severe mental illness that terrified even his father. When Don Carlos died at age 23 under mysterious circumstances, many suspected that Philip had ordered his own son's death to prevent him from inheriting the throne. But Philip's matrimonial choices only compounded the dynasty's genetic problems. His fourth wife, Anna of Austria, was his niece, and their children inherited an even more concentrated dose of Habsburg DNA. Philip's surviving son, Philip III, showed clear signs of cognitive impairment and relied entirely on court favorites to govern his vast empire. The Spanish territories that had once been the engine of European politics began their long decline under rulers who were increasingly incapable of effective leadership. The Habsburg family tree during this period resembles a ladder more than a tree, with each generation marrying back into itself rather than branching out into new genetic territory. Philip III married Margaret of Austria, his double first cousin. Their son, Philip IV, married Mariana of Austria, who was simultaneously his niece and his cousin. The mathematical complexity of these relationships requires charts and diagrams to untangle, but the genetic consequences were brutally simple. Each generation became more inbred than the last, concentrating harmful recessive genes while eliminating the genetic diversity that might have provided biological resilience. Contemporary observers began noticing disturbing patterns in Habsburg children. High rates of infant mortality plagued the dynasty, with many babies dying within weeks of birth from mysterious ailments that physicians couldn't understand or treat. Those who survived often displayed physical deformities, developmental delays, and chronic health problems that made them poor candidates for the demanding role of absolute monarchy. Palace physicians documented cases of Habsburg children who couldn't learn to walk until age 4, who remained unable to speak coherently into adulthood, and who suffered from seizures that left them unconscious for hours at a time. The Austrian branch of the Habsburg family, meanwhile, pursued their own destructive course of intermarriage. Emperor Ferdinand II, ruling from 1619 to 1637, married his cousin Maria Anna of Bavaria, while their son Ferdinand III married his cousin Maria Anna of Spain. The Austrian territories, once the heartland of Habsburg power, began experiencing the same pattern of declining rulers and failing succession as their Spanish cousins. Children were born with cleft palates, club feet, and facial deformities that made public appearances increasingly difficult to arrange. Court artists were instructed to minimize these physical problems in official portraits, creating an idealized version of Habsburg royalty that bore little resemblance to the genetic reality behind palace walls. The diplomatic consequences of Habsburg inbreeding extended far beyond the dynasty itself. European politics had been shaped for centuries by the assumption that Habsburg territories would be ruled by competent, if not brilliant monarchs who could navigate the complex web of international alliances and conflicts. But as Habsburg rulers became increasingly incapable of effective governance, other European powers began filling the vacuum. France under Louis XIV seized the initiative in European politics, while the Ottoman Empire pressed deeper into Habsburg territories in Eastern Europe. The decline of Habsburg power created instability across the continent as traditional power balances collapsed. Religious conflicts intensified as Habsburg rulers proved unable to manage the complex religious divisions within their territories. The 30 Years' War, one of the most destructive conflicts in European history, was partly the result of Habsburg inability to maintain effective control over their German territories. Ferdinand II's religious fanaticism, combined with his genetic predisposition toward mental instability, led to policies that inflamed Protestant resistance and created the conditions for a war that would devastate Central Europe for 3 decades. The economic consequences were equally severe. The Spanish Empire's vast wealth from American silver mines had funded European politics for over a century, but Habsburg mismanagement led to repeated bankruptcies and fiscal crises. Philip IV declared bankruptcy 4 times during his reign, while his mentally impaired successors proved incapable of implementing the economic reforms necessary to restore Spanish finances. The empire that had once been the wealthiest in the world began its long slide into irrelevance, partly because its rulers lacked the cognitive capacity to understand the complex economic forces they were supposed to control. By the middle of the 17th century, the Habsburg dynasty had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of concentrating power within families that had also concentrated harmful genetic traits. Other European royal houses began deliberately avoiding Habsburg marriage alliances, understanding that the once prestigious connections now carried unacceptable risks. The French Bourbons, the English Stuarts, and the Swedish Vasas all pursued marriage strategies that emphasized genetic diversity over dynastic purity, learning from the Habsburg example what not to do. Yet the Habsburgs themselves seemed incapable of recognizing the pattern or changing course. Each generation continued the same destructive marriage practices, believing that their problems were the result of divine punishment or foreign conspiracies rather than their own genetic choices. Court physicians who dared suggest that royal intermarriage might be connected to the dynasty's health problems were dismissed or worse. The ideology of royal blood purity had become so central to Habsburg identity that questioning it was tantamount to treason. The Spanish branch of the family, meanwhile, was approaching complete genetic collapse. Charles II's parents, Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece, meaning Charles inherited genetic material from only 6 great-great-grandparents instead of the normal 16. His coefficient of inbreeding was higher than that typically seen in children born to brother-sister relationships. The mathematical impossibility of his genetic situation meant that Charles was doomed from birth to suffer from multiple genetic disorders simultaneously. The medical records kept by Charles's personal physician, Dr. Gaspar Bravo de Sobremonte, read like a catalog of genetic horrors. Charles suffered from what modern doctors recognize as multiple inherited disorders occurring simultaneously. His enlarged tongue and protruding jaw made eating solid food impossible, forcing palace staff to prepare liquid meals that he could barely swallow. His legs were so weak and malformed that he didn't learn to walk until age 8, and even then required constant support to remain upright. Seizures struck him without warning, sometimes lasting for hours while courtiers stood helplessly by, watching their king convulse on floors that had once hosted the most powerful rulers in Europe. But Charles's physical disabilities were overshadowed by his mental incapacity. Palace tutors reported that he never learned to read beyond a child's level, couldn't perform simple arithmetic, and showed no understanding of the political complexities facing his empire. When foreign ambassadors arrived for audiences, Charles would often stare blankly at them, drooling uncontrollably while his ministers attempted to conduct negotiations around his vacant presence. The man who theoretically ruled territories spanning 4 continents couldn't comprehend a simple conversation about trade agreements or military alliances. The Spanish court developed elaborate protocols to hide Charles's condition from public view. Official ceremonies were carefully choreographed to minimize his speaking requirements and limit his physical movements. When he had to appear in public, servants would position him carefully and surround him with courtiers who could intervene if he began having seizures or became confused. Portrait artists received specific instructions about how to minimize his deformities, though even the most skilled painters struggled to create flattering images of a man whose genetic burden was written across every feature of his face and body. The succession crisis that loomed over Charles's reign represented the ultimate failure of Habsburg genetic engineering. Despite 2 marriages arranged specifically to produce heirs, Charles remained childless. His first wife, Marie-Louise d'Orléans, died after 10 years of marriage without conceiving, possibly because Charles was physically incapable of consummation. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, endured 14 years of marriage that produced no children, despite desperate attempts by palace physicians to address what they euphemistically termed the king's reproductive difficulties. The dynasty that had controlled European politics for 2 centuries was approaching extinction, not through military defeat or political revolution, but through the simple biological reality that their genetic experiment had finally reached its logical conclusion. The Austrian Habsburgs, meanwhile, were experiencing their own genetic catastrophe, though they managed to conceal it more effectively than their Spanish cousins. Emperor Leopold I, Charles's cousin and contemporary, suffered from similar physical deformities and mental limitations, but the complexity of the Holy Roman Empire's political structure allowed his ministers to govern effectively in his name. Leopold's children, however, showed even more severe manifestations of Habsburg genetic problems. His son Joseph, who briefly ruled as Emperor Joseph I, died at age 32 from what palace physicians described as mysterious ailments that modern doctors recognize as symptoms of severe genetic disorders. The marriage negotiations that dominated European diplomacy during this period reveal how completely the Habsburg genetic crisis had altered the continental balance of power. Once, every European royal house had competed for Habsburg marriage alliances, understanding that such connections brought wealth, territory, and political influence. But by the late 17th century, other dynasties were actively avoiding Habsburg marriages, recognizing that the genetic risks outweighed any political advantages. French, English, and Dutch royal houses began implementing what amounted to genetic screening, carefully researching the health histories of potential marriage partners to avoid the Habsburg trap. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, exemplified this new approach to royal genetics. Despite multiple opportunities to arrange marriages with Habsburg relatives, Louis consistently chose brides from genetically distant families. His own robust health and that of his numerous children demonstrated the advantages of genetic diversity, while the contrast with the ailing Spanish Habsburgs became a source of French diplomatic advantage. Louis could negotiate from a position of strength, knowing that his dynasty's biological future was secure while his Habsburg rivals were literally dying out. The economic consequences of Habsburg genetic decline rippled throughout the European economy. Spanish territories that had once been efficiently administered began suffering from chronic misgovernment, as mentally impaired rulers made increasingly irrational decisions. The flow of silver from American mines, which had funded European trade for over a century, became erratic as colonial administrators received contradictory or incomprehensible orders from Madrid. Charles's inability to understand basic financial concepts led to policies that accelerated Spanish economic decline, including currency debastements that triggered inflation throughout Europe. Military affairs suffered equally dramatic consequences. The Spanish army, once the terror of European battlefields, found itself commanded by officers appointed based on their ability to manage Charles's disabilities rather than their military competence. Battle plans had to be simplified to accommodate a king who couldn't understand tactical complexity, while strategic decisions were often delayed or abandoned entirely when Charles became confused or suffered seizures during military conferences. The empire that had once conquered much of the New World and dominated European warfare was reduced to a defensive posture, desperately trying to hold territory rather than expanding its influence. The religious implications of Habsburg decline created additional complications throughout Catholic Europe. As the most powerful Catholic dynasty, the Habsburgs had served as the papacy's primary secular arm, leading the Counter-Reformation and defending Catholic interests against Protestant expansion. But Charles's obvious mental limitations raised troubling theological questions about divine right and papal authority. If God truly appointed kings to rule, why would he curse the Catholic Church's greatest offenders with such obvious disabilities? These questions undermined Catholic political theory at precisely the moment when Protestant powers were gaining strength throughout Northern Europe. Palace life in Madrid during Charles's reign resembled a grotesque theater, where everyone knew the lead actor was incapable of performing his role, but the show had to continue anyway. Courtiers developed elaborate euphemisms to discuss the king's condition, referring to his seizures as divine visitations and his mental incapacity as holy simplicity. Foreign diplomats learned to conduct real negotiations with the king's ministers while participating in the fiction that Charles was making actual decisions. The entire apparatus of Spanish government became an exercise in collective delusion, with hundreds of people pretending that their genetically destroyed king was capable of ruling one of the world's largest empires. The scientific revolution occurring throughout Europe during this period made Habsburg genetic problems increasingly difficult to ignore or explain away. Natural philosophers like Isaac Newton and Robert Hooke were developing new understanding of biological processes, while physicians were beginning to recognize hereditary patterns in human diseases. Some court doctors privately suspected connections between royal intermarriage and the health problems plaguing Habsburg children, but expressing such theories publicly remained dangerous. The ideology of royal blood purity was so fundamental to Habsburg legitimacy that questioning it could result in exile, imprisonment, or worse. Meanwhile, other European dynasties were quietly learning from the Habsburg example and implementing their own reforms. The House of Hanover, which would eventually rule Britain, deliberately sought marriage partners from genetically distant German principalities. The Russian Romanovs began requiring detailed health investigations before approving royal marriages. Even smaller royal houses started maintaining informal genetic records, tracking which family lines produced healthy children and which seemed prone to inherited disorders. The Habsburg catastrophe was becoming a textbook case of what happened when political considerations completely overrode biological reality. The cultural impact of Habsburg decline extended beyond politics into art, literature, and popular consciousness. Court painters struggled to create dignified portraits of increasingly deformed rulers, while writers developed coded language to discuss royal disabilities without committing treason. Popular ballads and folk tales began incorporating themes about cursed bloodlines and the dangers of excessive pride, clearly referencing the Habsburg situation without naming names directly. The dynasty that had once been celebrated as the pinnacle of European nobility was becoming a cautionary tale about the limits of human ambition and the consequences of defying natural law. As Charles's health deteriorated throughout the 1690s, European chancelleries began preparing for the inevitable succession crisis. The Spanish Empire was too large and wealthy to simply disappear, but Charles had no direct heirs, and his closest relatives were either equally incapacitated or ruled competing powers. The War of Spanish Succession, which would engulf Europe for over a decade, was already being planned in the courts of France, Austria, and England. The Habsburg genetic experiment, which had begun as a strategy to concentrate power and preserve dynastic purity, was about to trigger the largest European conflict since the 30 Years' War. The morning of October 20th, 1700, dawned gray and cold over Madrid. But inside the royal alcazar, the air was thick with the stench of death and desperation. Charles II lay dying in his ornate bed, his grotesquely deformed body finally succumbing to the genetic burden his ancestors had imposed upon him. Around his bedside, European diplomats disguised as concerned relatives whispered urgently about succession plans, their eyes already fixed on the vast territories that would soon need new rulers. The last Spanish Habsburg was about to breathe his final breath, and with him would die the most catastrophic experiment in royal genetics that Europe had ever witnessed. But Charles wasn't dying alone. Across the Habsburg domains, his Austrian cousins were facing their own genetic reckoning. Emperor Leopold I, despite his political success in defending Vienna against Ottoman siege, was watching his own children succumb to the same hereditary curse that was killing Charles. Leopold's son and heir, Archduke Joseph, showed all the familiar signs of Habsburg genetic decline. His jaw protruded so severely that he couldn't eat properly, his speech was barely intelligible, and his frequent seizures left him unconscious for hours at a time. The Austrian court had become expert at hiding these episodes from foreign observers, but the reality was undeniable. The Habsburg bloodline was destroying itself from within, and no amount of political maneuvering could change the biological facts. The death throes of Habsburg genetics created ripple effects throughout European society that extended far beyond royal palaces. In the Spanish Netherlands, administrators who hadn't received coherent orders from Madrid in months began making independent decisions about taxation and military deployment. Colonial governors in the Americas found themselves ruling vast territories with no meaningful oversight from a monarch who couldn't understand the reports they sent him. The entire Spanish imperial system, built over 2 centuries of careful expansion and administration, was collapsing because its theoretical head was genetically incapable of performing even basic governmental functions. French spies operating in Madrid during Charles's final years sent back reports that read like medical case studies rather than diplomatic intelligence. They documented a king who spent most days in a semi-conscious state, occasionally rousing to make incomprehensible demands that his ministers had to interpret and ignore. Charles would sometimes become fixated on particular objects or people, staring at them for hours while drooling uncontrollably. Other days, he would experience violent episodes where he would strike anyone who came near him. His limited cognitive function overwhelmed by rage he couldn't articulate or understand. The palace staff developed elaborate protocols for managing these outbursts, but foreign visitors occasionally witnessed scenes that shattered any remaining illusions about Habsburg competence. The religious crisis surrounding Charles' condition reached its peak during his final confession. Father Gabriel Ponteos, the king's confessor, spent days trying to determine whether Charles possessed sufficient mental capacity to receive last rites. Church doctrine required genuine understanding and repentance for the sacraments to be valid, but Charles seemed incapable of comprehending even basic theological concepts. When Ponteos asked him to confess his sins, Charles would stare blankly and then begin reciting fragments of childhood prayers he had memorized decades earlier. The spectacle of a dying king who couldn't understand his own mortality created theological complications that the Vatican preferred not to examine too closely. The autopsy performed on Charles after his death revealed the full extent of the genetic damage inflicted by 2 centuries of inbreeding. Dr. Portocarrero, the royal physician, documented abnormalities that encompassed virtually every organ system. Charles's heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were corroded, his intestines were putrefied, and his brain was filled with water instead of normal tissue. His single testicle was completely black, explaining his inability to produce heirs despite 2 marriages. Most shocking of all, his body contained virtually no blood, as if the genetic defects had prevented normal blood production. The physician's report, suppressed for decades, read like a catalog of everything that could go wrong with human genetics when natural diversity was systematically eliminated. The immediate aftermath of Charles's death plunged Europe into chaos that had been brewing for decades. The War of Spanish Succession erupted as France, Austria, and their respective allies fought to claim territories that Charles's genetic incapacity had left without legitimate heirs. But this wasn't simply a traditional dynastic war. It was the first European conflict caused directly by genetic collapse, a recognition that royal bloodlines could become so corrupted that they ceased to function as legitimate sources of political authority. The very concept of hereditary monarchy was being challenged by the biological reality of what happened when royal families took their genetic isolation to its logical extreme. Philip of Anjou, Louis XIII's grandson, eventually claimed the Spanish throne as Philip V, but his victory came with a terrible irony. The French Bourbons had gained control of the Spanish Empire precisely because they had avoided the genetic trap that destroyed the Habsburgs. Philip was healthy, intelligent, and capable of effective rule because his parents had married outside their immediate family circle. The contrast between the robust Bourbon prince and the genetically destroyed Habsburg he replaced couldn't have been more stark. European observers understood immediately that they were witnessing a transition from one form of royal legitimacy to another, from bloodline purity to genetic diversity. The Austrian Habsburgs, meanwhile, were conducting their own desperate experiments to save their dynasty from genetic extinction. Emperor Leopold's advisors began secretly consulting with physicians and natural philosophers about the biological principles governing heredity. These early genetic counselors, working without modern scientific knowledge but guided by centuries of observation, recommended that the Austrian royal family immediately cease intermarriage and seek brides from the most genetically distant European houses available. The advice came almost too late. Leopold's surviving children showed such severe genetic damage that finding suitable marriage partners became increasingly difficult. Archduke Charles, later Emperor Charles VI, represented the Austrian Habsburgs' last hope for genetic recovery. Unlike his Spanish cousins, Charles had inherited enough cognitive function to understand the crisis facing his dynasty. He deliberately sought a marriage partner from outside the traditional Habsburg alliance network, eventually marrying Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel. Their children, while still showing some Habsburg genetic markers, demonstrated significantly improved health compared to previous generations. The Austrian branch of the family had learned from their Spanish relatives' catastrophic example and taken steps to prevent complete genetic collapse. The scientific community across Europe began quietly studying the Habsburg case as evidence for emerging theories about biological inheritance. Natural philosophers who had been developing ideas about how traits passed from parents to children found in the Habsburg dynasty a perfect case study of what happened when genetic isolation reached extreme levels. These early geneticists, working centuries before DNA would be discovered, nevertheless understood that the Habsburg example demonstrated fundamental principles about the importance of genetic diversity in maintaining species health. Popular culture throughout Europe began incorporating the Habsburg story into folklore and moral instruction. Fairy tales about cursed bloodlines and the dangers of excessive pride clearly referenced the Spanish royal family's fate, while traveling performers created theatrical productions that dramatized the consequences of royal arrogance. The Habsburg genetic catastrophe had become a cautionary tale that parents used to teach children about the importance of humility and the dangers of believing oneself above natural law. The dynasty that had once been the pinnacle of European prestige was becoming a symbol of human folly and divine judgment. Medical schools across Europe began using Habsburg case studies to teach students about hereditary diseases and the importance of genetic diversity in human reproduction. Physicians who had served in royal courts shared their observations about the patterns of inherited disorders they had witnessed, contributing to a growing body of knowledge about human genetics. The Habsburg example became foundational to early medical understanding of how genetic isolation could produce devastating health consequences across multiple generations. The economic consequences of Habsburg genetic collapse continued reverberating throughout the 18th century. Spanish territories that had been systematically mismanaged during Charles's reign required decades of reconstruction under Bourbon rule. Colonial administrations had to be completely reorganized, trade relationships reestablished, and financial systems rebuilt from scratch. The genetic incompetence of the final Spanish Habsburgs had cost their empire centuries of economic progress and condemned millions of subjects to poverty and instability. Military historians studying the decline of Spanish power identified the Habsburg genetic crisis as a crucial factor in the empire's inability to maintain its European dominance. Armies commanded by mentally incapacitated rulers had made strategic errors that cost territories, resources, and prestige. The Spanish military's decline from European hegemon to defensive mediocrity paralleled exactly the genetic decline of the dynasty that commanded it. Wars that might have been won with competent leadership were lost, because Habsburg rulers literally lacked the cognitive capacity to understand military strategy. The diplomatic revolution that followed the War of Spanish Succession established new principles for European international relations that explicitly rejected the old Habsburg model of dynastic politics. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 created a balance of power mechanisms designed to prevent any single dynasty from accumulating the kind of territorial concentration that had made Habsburg intermarriage seem politically necessary. European statesmen had learned that allowing royal families to become genetically isolated created dangers that extended far beyond the dynasties themselves. Religious authorities across Catholic Europe were forced to grapple with theological implications of the Habsburg collapse that challenged fundamental assumptions about divine right and papal authority. If God truly appointed kings to rule, how could his chosen dynasty become so obviously unfit for leadership? Jesuit theologians developed elaborate explanations about divine punishment for royal pride, while other Catholic thinkers began questioning whether hereditary monarchy itself might be contrary to divine will. The Habsburg genetic catastrophe had created a crisis of legitimacy that extended throughout the Catholic political order. The Protestant powers of Northern Europe, meanwhile, used the Habsburg example to justify their own political systems and religious beliefs. English, Dutch, and German Protestant writers produced pamphlets arguing that the Catholic emphasis on bloodline purity had led directly to the Spanish royal family's biological destruction. They claimed that Protestant principles of individual merit and divine election were more compatible with natural law than Catholic dynasticism. The Habsburg genetic collapse became a propaganda weapon in the ongoing religious conflicts that divided European Christianity. Scientific societies across Europe began corresponding about the Habsburg case, and its implications for understanding human reproduction and inheritance. The Royal Society of London, the French Academy of Sciences, and similar institutions in other countries shared observations about genetic patterns and hereditary diseases. The Habsburg dynasty, in its destruction, was contributing to the advancement of human knowledge about genetics and biology in ways that their living members never could have achieved. The cultural impact of the Habsburg genetic catastrophe extended into literature, art, and philosophy throughout the 18th century. Writers like Voltaire used the Spanish royal family's fate as evidence for Enlightenment arguments about reason, natural law, and the dangers of traditional authority. Artists created allegorical paintings depicting the fall of dynasties that clearly referenced the Habsburg example. Philosophers incorporated the Habsburg story into broader theories about human nature, political legitimacy, and the relationship between biology and social organization. The medical profession began developing ethical guidelines for treating hereditary diseases based partly on observations of how palace physicians had handled the Habsburg genetic crisis. Doctors debated whether they had obligations to warn royal families about the dangers of intermarriage, even when such warnings might be considered treasonous. The Habsburg case became a foundational example in early discussions about medical ethics and the responsibilities of physicians to their patients versus their political superiors. European royal houses spent decades after the Habsburg collapse developing new marriage strategies designed to prevent similar genetic catastrophes in their own dynasties. Genealogical research became a crucial component of diplomatic negotiations as royal families sought to identify potential marriage partners who were genetically distant enough to avoid Habsburg-style problems. Marriage contracts began including provisions about health histories and family genetic backgrounds, though this information was rarely made public. The Habsburg genetic experiment had failed so completely that it changed forever how European royalty understood the relationship between political power and biological reality. The dynasty that had once controlled more territory than any European house in history had literally bred itself out of existence, leaving behind only a cautionary tale about the dangers of confusing genetic isolation with genetic superiority. Their empire had been divided among healthier dynasties, their territories redistributed to rulers who understood that political survival required biological diversity. As the 18th century progressed and Enlightenment ideas about reason and natural law gained influence, the Habsburg story became a standard reference point for discussions about the relationship between human biology and political systems. Their genetic catastrophe had demonstrated that even the most powerful dynasties were subject to natural laws that could not be violated with impunity. The Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs had learned too late that royal blood was still human blood, and that human blood required diversity to remain healthy across generations. The story of Habsburg genetic collapse didn't end with Charles II's death. It evolved into something even more sinister as other European dynasties absorbed the lessons but applied them selectively. The Portuguese House of Braganza, watching Spain's catastrophic example unfold across their border, made a chilling calculation. Rather than abandon royal intermarriage entirely, they decided to practice it more strategically, believing they could harvest the political benefits of concentrated bloodlines while avoiding the most extreme genetic consequences. They were catastrophically wrong. King John V of Portugal, ruling from 1706 to 1750, witnessed firsthand the collapse of Spanish Habsburg power and concluded that the problem wasn't inbreeding itself, but excessive inbreeding. His solution was to implement what palace physicians secretly called controlled bloodline management, a system where Portuguese royals would marry cousins, but not the closest possible cousins. They would skip one generation instead of marrying siblings or parent-child relationships. This half-measure approach created a slower-burning genetic catastrophe that was arguably more cruel than the Spanish version because it gave false hope while still destroying the dynasty from within. The first generation of this improved Portuguese inbreeding seemed to validate John's strategy. His children appeared healthier than their Spanish Habsburg contemporaries, showing only mild versions of the characteristic jaw deformities and cognitive problems. But genetics doesn't respect human attempts at compromise. The harmful recessive genes were still concentrating with each generation, just at a slower pace. Portuguese court physicians documented increasingly severe problems appearing in grandchildren and great-grandchildren who seemed genetically doomed despite their parents' apparent health. Prince Joseph, heir to the Portuguese throne, embodied the deceptive nature of this genetic compromise. Born in 1714, he appeared normal in infancy and early childhood, allowing his parents to believe their breeding strategy had succeeded. But as Joseph matured, subtle signs of genetic damage became apparent. His speech remained slurred despite years of tutoring. His coordination was poor enough that he couldn't master basic horseback riding or sword fighting skills expected of royal princes. Most troubling of all, his cognitive development plateaued around age 12, leaving him with the mental capacity of a child in the body of a grown man. The Portuguese court developed elaborate systems to conceal Joseph's limitations, while maintaining the fiction that their royal bloodline remained strong. Palace tutors were instructed to focus on rote memorization rather than analytical thinking, allowing Joseph to recite prepared responses during formal audiences without revealing his inability to understand complex political discussions. Court artists painted him in poses that minimized his physical awkwardness, while diplomatic protocol was adjusted to reduce his speaking requirements during international negotiations. The entire Portuguese government became complicit in hiding the genetic consequences of their supposedly moderate inbreeding strategy. But the most disturbing aspect of the Portuguese experiment was how it influenced other European dynasties that were searching for alternatives to complete genetic isolation or total outcrossing. The early apparent success of Portuguese controlled inbreeding encouraged similar experiments across Catholic Europe, where political pressures still favored dynastic marriages over genetic diversity. The House of Savoy in Italy, the Wittelsbachs in Bavaria, and various German principalities began implementing their own versions of strategic intermarriage, convinced they could outsmart biology through careful planning and mathematical precision. The results were uniformly catastrophic, though each dynasty's genetic collapse followed slightly different timelines and manifestations. The Italian Savoy family produced a generation of princes who appeared healthy, but suffered from severe hemophilia that didn't manifest until they reached adulthood. Bavarian Wittelsbach children seemed normal until puberty, when they began developing the same mental instabilities that had plagued earlier generations of completely inbred royals. German princes who married their second cousins instead of first cousins still produced children with distinctive facial deformities and developmental delays, just delayed by a generation compared to more extreme inbreeding. The scientific community of the early 18th century began recognizing these patterns and developing primitive theories about what they called bloodline corruption. Natural philosophers like Pierre-Louis Moreau de Maupertuis in France and Albrecht von Haller in Switzerland started documenting how genetic problems seemed to accumulate over generations, even when royal families attempted to moderate their inbreeding practices. These early geneticists couldn't explain the mechanisms involved, but they could observe the consistent patterns of hereditary disease appearing in dynasties that practiced any form of systematic intermarriage. The French court of Louis XV became a laboratory for studying the contrast between genetically diverse and genetically isolated royal bloodlines. French princes who married German, Polish, or Italian nobility consistently produced healthier children than their Spanish, Portuguese, or Austrian counterparts, who continued various forms of dynastic intermarriage. Palace physicians began keeping detailed medical records comparing the health outcomes of different marriage strategies, creating the first systematic studies of human genetics disguised as royal medical care. Dr. François Quesnay, personal physician to Madame de Pompadour and medical advisor to the French court, produced secret reports analyzing the health patterns of European royal houses that read like modern genetic surveys. His observations, preserved in encrypted correspondence with other court physicians, documented how genetic problems appeared to follow mathematical patterns related to the degree of family relationship between royal parents. Quesnay's work represented the beginning of scientific genetics, though it would be another century before anyone understood the biological mechanisms he was observing. The diplomatic consequences of continued royal genetic problems created new forms of international instability throughout the mid-18th century. The War of Austrian Succession, which engulfed Europe from 1740 to 1748, was partly triggered by questions about whether Maria Theresa of Austria was mentally competent to inherit the Habsburg domains. Enemy propaganda focused on her family's history of genetic problems, arguing that allowing her to rule would perpetuate the biological incompetence that had already destroyed the Spanish branch of her dynasty. These genetic attacks on royal legitimacy represented a new form of international warfare that targeted bloodlines rather than armies. The British response to continental European genetic chaos was characteristically pragmatic and ruthless. The Hanoverian dynasty, which had gained the British throne through political maneuvering rather than ancient bloodlines, deliberately emphasized their genetic diversity as a source of political strength. King George II's marriage to Caroline of Ansbach, from a completely different German principality, produced children whose robust health contrasted sharply with their genetically compromised continental counterparts. British diplomatic correspondence from this period reveals calculated efforts to highlight the genetic superiority of the Hanoverian line over their Habsburg, Bourbon, and other continental rivals. The Russian Empire under Empress Elizabeth implemented perhaps the most systematic genetic policy of any 18th century power. Elizabeth herself, the daughter of Peter the Great's strategic marriage to a Lithuanian peasant girl, understood intuitively that genetic diversity strengthened dynasties, while genetic isolation destroyed them. She established formal policies requiring detailed genealogical research before approving any marriage involving the Russian royal family, effectively creating the first state-sponsored genetic screening program in European history. Russian nobles seeking imperial approval for marriages had to prove that their potential spouses came from genetically distant bloodlines. The economic implications of royal genetic decline continued rippling through European commerce and colonial administration throughout the mid-18th century. Portuguese territories in Brazil and Africa suffered from inconsistent governance, as Prince Joseph's cognitive limitations made coherent colonial policy impossible. Italian states ruled by genetically compromised Savoy princes experienced similar administrative chaos, while German territories under Wittelsbach control saw their economies stagnate under rulers who couldn't understand basic principles of taxation and trade regulation. The genetic incompetence of European royalty was costing their subjects prosperity and stability on a massive scale. The Catholic Church found itself in an increasingly impossible position as genetic problems continued plaguing Catholic royal houses, while Protestant dynasties that practiced genetic diversity remained relatively healthy. Jesuit theologians produced elaborate treatises attempting to reconcile divine right theory with the obvious biological failures of Catholic monarchy. But their arguments became increasingly strained as evidence mounted that genetic isolation led inevitably to royal incompetence. Some progressive Catholic thinkers began privately questioning whether God might actually favor genetic diversity over bloodline purity, a theological revolution that challenged centuries of Catholic political theory. The emergence of Enlightenment philosophy during this period provided intellectual frameworks for understanding royal genetic problems that extended far beyond medical or theological explanations. Voltaire, Diderot, and other philosophes used the continued genetic collapse of European royal houses as evidence for their arguments about reason, natural law, and the importance of questioning traditional authority. The Habsburg genetic catastrophe had become a cornerstone of Enlightenment political theory, proving that even the most established institutions were subject to natural laws that human arrogance couldn't overcome. Scientific societies across Europe began conducting systematic studies of heredity, using royal genealogies as their primary data source. The abundance of detailed records kept by royal houses, combined with the obvious patterns of genetic problems appearing in certain bloodlines, provided unprecedented opportunities for early genetic research. The Royal Society of London established a secret committee to study royal heredity patterns, while the French Academy of Sciences created similar research programs disguised as historical genealogical projects. These early genetic studies, conducted centuries before DNA would be discovered, nevertheless identified fundamental principles about inheritance that would later be confirmed by modern molecular biology. The development of what we now recognize as genetic counseling began in the royal courts of mid-18th century Europe, though it was disguised as genealogical research and diplomatic protocol. Court physicians and learned advisors began providing systematic guidance to royal families about which marriage alliances would likely produce healthy children and which would perpetuate genetic problems. This early genetic counseling was necessarily crude, based on observation rather than scientific understanding, but it represented the first systematic attempts to apply biological knowledge to human reproductive decisions. The artistic and literary culture of the period began reflecting growing awareness of genetic problems in royal bloodlines through increasingly sophisticated allegories and coded references. Court painters developed visual techniques for minimizing genetic deformities in royal portraits while still maintaining artistic integrity. Writers created literary works that used metaphorical language to discuss hereditary problems without directly challenging royal authority. The cultural elite of 18th century Europe became expert at communicating genetic realities through symbolic representation that could be understood by educated audiences while remaining officially deniable. The military consequences of continued royal genetic decline became apparent during the Seven Years' War, when several European armies found themselves commanded by princes whose genetic limitations made effective military leadership impossible. The Austrian army's performance during the early phases of the conflict was hampered by Archduke Charles's inability to understand complex battle plans, while Portuguese forces in South America suffered defeats partly attributable to orders from Prince Joseph that reflected his cognitive limitations rather than military necessity. Genetic incompetence at the highest levels of command was costing thousands of soldiers their lives and determining the outcomes of international conflicts. The colonial implications of royal genetic problems extended throughout European overseas empires, where distant territories were administered by governors who received instructions from genetically compromised monarchs. Portuguese Brazil experienced periods of administrative chaos when Prince Joseph issued contradictory orders that colonial officials couldn't reconcile with local realities. Spanish territories in the Americas continued suffering from the legacy of Charles II's genetic incapacity, while newer Spanish Bourbon rulers struggled to repair centuries of colonial mismanagement. The genetic problems of European royal houses were affecting millions of colonial subjects who had no voice in the marriage decisions that determined their rulers' competence. The emergence of new medical specialties focused on hereditary diseases reflected growing recognition that genetic problems weren't limited to royal families but affected all social classes. Physicians began identifying genetic disorders in merchant families, noble houses, and even peasant communities where intermarriage had been practiced for economic rather than political reasons. The royal genetic catastrophes had revealed universal principles about human heredity that applied across all social boundaries, leading to new forms of medical knowledge that would eventually benefit entire populations. The insurance industry, still in its early stages during the mid-18th century, began incorporating genetic risk assessments into policies covering royal families and major noble houses. Lloyd's of London and other emerging insurance companies developed crude actuarial tables based on family health histories, recognizing that genetic factors could be quantified and priced like other forms of risk. These early genetic risk assessments represented the beginning of what would eventually become modern medical underwriting, though the terminology and scientific understanding were still centuries away from current practice. The philosophical implications of royal genetic decline contributed to broader Enlightenment discussions about human nature, social organization, and political legitimacy. If royal bloodlines could become corrupted through natural processes, what did that suggest about the divine right of kings? If genetic diversity was necessary for biological health, what did that imply about social and political diversity? The Habsburg genetic catastrophe and its ongoing consequences throughout European royal houses provided concrete evidence for abstract philosophical arguments about the importance of change, diversity, and adaptation in human institutions. The development of what would eventually become modern public health policy began with attempts to address the genetic problems plaguing European royal families. Court physicians who had observed the devastating effects of genetic isolation began advocating for policies that would encourage genetic diversity throughout their societies. These early public health advocates understood intuitively that the same biological principles affecting royal families also applied to their subjects, leading to primitive but effective recommendations about marriage patterns and family planning that would benefit entire populations. As the 18th century progressed toward its revolutionary conclusion, the genetic collapse of European royal houses had created a crisis of legitimacy that extended far beyond individual dynasties. The biological failure of supposedly superior bloodlines was undermining the theoretical foundations of monarchy itself, contributing to political instabilities that would eventually explode into revolution and war. The Habsburg genetic experiment, begun as a strategy to concentrate and preserve royal power, was ultimately destroying the entire system of European aristocracy from within, proving that no human institution could violate natural law without eventually paying a devastating price. The French Revolution that erupted in 1789 wasn't just about bread prices and political grievances. Hidden beneath the surface of social upheaval lay a biological crisis that had been building for generations. The genetic collapse of European royal houses had created a legitimacy vacuum that revolutionary ideologies rushed to fill. When Parisian mobs stormed the Bastille, they weren't just attacking political tyranny, they were unconsciously rebelling against centuries of genetic incompetence disguised as divine authority. Marie Antoinette, the Austrian princess who became the symbol of royal excess, embodied this genetic political crisis in ways that contemporary revolutionaries couldn't fully articulate but instinctively understood. Her Habsburg bloodline carried the same genetic burden that had destroyed the Spanish branch of her family, though in diluted form thanks to her mother Maria Theresa's strategic marriage choices. Yet even this partial genetic recovery couldn't mask the fundamental disconnect between royal pretensions and biological reality that French citizens witnessed daily in their rulers' obvious inadequacies. The revolutionary pamphlets that flooded Paris during the 1790s reveal how genetic arguments had penetrated popular consciousness, even without scientific terminology to describe what people were observing. Writers like Jacques Hébert and Jean-Paul Marat instinctively understood that royal claims to genetic superiority were contradicted by the obvious physical and mental deficiencies they could observe in their rulers. Revolutionary propaganda didn't need to understand chromosomes or recessive genes to recognize that centuries of royal inbreeding had produced leaders who were manifestly unfit for the responsibilities they claimed by birthright. The execution of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette represented more than political revolution. It marked the first time in European history that a royal bloodline was literally eliminated based partly on recognition of its genetic inadequacy. The revolutionary tribunals that condemned them to death used language that mixed political accusations with biological observations about the inherent corruption of royal bloodlines. The guillotine blade that severed their necks was cutting through centuries of genetic mythology as much as human tissue. Napoleon Bonaparte's rise to power demonstrated how genetic diversity could triumph over aristocratic bloodlines when institutional barriers were removed. Born to minor Corsican nobility with no connection to the intermarried royal houses of Europe, Napoleon possessed the intellectual vigor and physical energy that centuries of Habsburg genetics had systematically eliminated from legitimate royal bloodlines. His military genius and administrative competence stood in stark contrast to the genetically compromised princes he defeated across European battlefields. The continental system that Napoleon imposed on Europe after 1806 represented the first systematic attempt to reorganize European politics around merit rather than bloodline, though Napoleon himself didn't conceptualize it in genetic terms. By promoting administrators and military commanders based on ability rather than aristocratic birth, Napoleon was unconsciously implementing a genetic meritocracy that favored the biological vigor of diverse bloodlines over the concentrated weaknesses of traditional royal houses. The Congress of Vienna in 1815, which attempted to restore pre-revolutionary European order, faced an impossible biological contradiction. The diplomats who gathered to redraw the continental map understood that the old royal bloodlines had been discredited not just politically but biologically. Yet they had no alternative framework for legitimacy, except to restore the same genetically compromised dynasties that had proven their incompetence over generations of inbreeding. The result was a political settlement that was doomed from the start because it ignored the genetic realities that had made revolution inevitable. The Holy Alliance formed by Russia, Prussia, and Austria after Napoleon's defeat represented a desperate attempt to restore divine right monarchy while ignoring the biological evidence that had undermined its foundations. Tsar Alexander III, Emperor Francis I of Austria, and King Frederick William III of Prussia pledged to govern according to Christian principles, but their own family histories demonstrated how royal genetics had diverged from any recognizable divine plan. Their alliance was built on bloodlines that had systematically eliminated the genetic diversity that might have given them the intellectual capacity to understand the forces reshaping European society. The revolutions of 1848 that swept across Europe represented the second wave of popular rebellion against genetically compromised royal authority. The Spring of Nations erupted simultaneously in France, Austria, Prussia, and dozens of smaller German and Italian states, partly because the restored royal houses had proven incapable of adapting to 19th century political and economic realities. Their genetic limitations, accumulated over centuries of intermarriage, had left them intellectually equipped for medieval feudalism but completely unprepared for industrial society. The Habsburg dynasty stands as history's most devastating proof that power without genetic wisdom is ultimately powerless. From the heights of European dominance to the grotesque spectacle of Charles II drooling on his throne, their story reveals how the very strategies meant to preserve royal authority became the instruments of its destruction. The marble palaces still stand, the crown jewels still glitter in museums, but the bloodlines that once commanded continents bred themselves into extinction through 2 centuries of genetic recklessness disguised as dynastic purity. Their legacy echoes through every modern discussion of power, privilege, and the dangerous illusion that human institutions can defy natural law indefinitely.